So this is a continuation to the analysis of identity through a Heideggerian perspective. In Being in Time, Heidegger makes explicit, to an extent, the identity of Dasein. And for those of you who are not Heideggerians or who have not read Being in Time, Dasein more or less refers to the human, to the identity of man. So the identity of man, what he calls the who of Dasein, is proximally and for the most part not itself. Dasein is everyone and no one at the same time. Dasein is world. Dasein self is proximally given by the world, the day, what he calls das Man. Now, 30 years later, Heidegger gave a lecture at the University of Freiburg where he treated the topic of identity and difference. So Heidegger begins by telling us that the principle of identity already presupposes the meaning of identity itself. It is no surprise that he tells us that a principle of thought is a principle of being. The equation A equals A rather tells us, or the better formulation would be that A is A. And so the is in between A is an ontological statement. Every A is itself, the same with itself. And it is that with itself that Heidegger emphasizes. Furthermore, sameness implies a relation that is mediated by the preposition with. So this is a good point to bring Hegel's identity, concept of identity, into the analysis. Hegel says, quote, "The essence lights up in itself, or is mere reflection, and therefore only self-relation, not as immediate, but as reflected. And that reflex relation is self-identity." End quote. So now, essentially, what Hegel is saying is, and just to unpack that quote a little bit, Hegel defines essence as essential as being in itself, only to the extent that it has in itself its negative. So Hegelian self-identity is a reflection mediated of being in itself with its external negation. And this is the difference that I was referring to. The Heidegger does not make explicit, but Hegel makes this very explicit, that identity without its external negation, without its difference, without its otherness, without its opposite, is not true identity. It's only an abstract, a part of identity. And so Hegel goes on to say that this is first discoverable in the ground of becoming. And so for Hegel, we know that everything is in motion. Everything is in a process, in a constant state of becoming. And so identity is no different. So this dialectical process gives rise to the new absolute identity, and this is only a partial moment of identity. This is an abstract identity in the sense that it only emphasizes a frozen moment in the dialectical motion of identity. True self-identity is always in motion and contains its mediation, its negation. So the equation A equals A, taken as a maxim, is only an abstract law of understanding, Hegel tells us. Hegel says that if someone were to ask the question of how is it that identity comes to difference, they would be assuming that identity is an abstract identity. And to emphasize, identity without difference is treating them as two separate entities. So again, just to recap, the ground for Hegel is the ground of becoming, where identity and difference unfold, where identity with its negation goes into the dialectical motion, and its identity, its process of becoming, unfolds. So back to Heidegger, he tells us that Parmenides saying, quote, thought and being are the same, end quote, requires that we think of sameness as a belonging together. Thought and being belong together. So if thinking and being belong together, where or how do they meet? Now, Heidegger tells us that the way that they encounter each other, is in the event of appropriation, or in German, this is reines. So, what is the event? What is the event of appropriation? And here I'm going to use the analysis by Daniela Vallega from University of Oregon. She tells us that the word for the event of appropriation comes from the German reines, as we just mentioned. And if we break this word down into two separate words, the first part of it, signifies begin in motion, and Agnes is related to the word eigen, as in the eigen, the proper, the onus, the same Eigenlicht that Heidegger has used in Being in Time for authenticity, or that has been translated into English as authenticity or inauthenticity. So, following Vallega's analysis, she tells us that the openness of the event is where the truth of being needs to be thought. So, in other words, the truth of being is something to be found in the space and the openness between everyday thinking and theoretical thinking. And so the thinking that addresses that openness, Heidegger calls that openness the abyss, is precisely where thought will be appropriated by being. Hence, the event of appropriation. And so here we can already see that thinking and being. So back to the lecture on identity and difference. So what does the event have to do with identity? Heidegger tells us that, quote, the appropriation appropriates being to their essential togetherness. The essential togetherness of being and thought, end quote. Heidegger concludes that it should be clear that being belongs together with thinking, which he calls the appropriation. And this is where we're just making reference to. Quote, the essence of identity is a property of the event of appropriation, end quote. And as we were saying before, the Hegelian ground of becoming is similar to the event of appropriation, where thought belongs together with being and identity shows itself. However, the Hegelian ground is a much simpler dialectic of becoming of being in itself and negation, whereas the event of appropriation is the abyss, the openness, the nothingness between thought and being as the ground of beings. Now, if you're as confused as I am as far as what Heidegger means by the being thought and being be the same, merging into unity in the event of appropriation, in the abyss, in the nothingness, Heidegger acknowledges the confusion. He says towards the end of the lecture that this thought This new way of conceptualizing, this new way of understanding, not conceptualizing, because again, that is referring back to concepts which are static, abstract identities, but this new way of thinking, not even this new way of philosophizing. Heidegger says we need to leave theoretical, philosophical, and everyday thinking behind. We need to start the task of thinking. So, in this new way of thinking, the identity of being in thought that happens in the openness and the truth of being, this is going to need some time to unfold. Heidegger says that it took more than 2,000 years to think the simple mediation of the identity between thought and being. So, this is not something that we are going to understand in one day. But in any case, Heidegger wants to make the point that this is, in any case, this is already the beginning process. And so it is a crucial step towards the future. So in conclusion, Heidegger has told us about the unity, the mediation, the identity between thought and being. And this gets expressed in the event of appropriation, where thought and being reach out to each other. And this is the space where we may grasp the ontological and ontec law that says A is A. And this might take time to be understood. The time for essential thinking is completely different from the time of computational thinking that pulls us in all sorts of directions. And here Heidegger says, after all, quote, today the computer calculates thousands of relations a second, unquote, and yet every single one of them is absolutely inessential.